Good morning, everybody. I aspire to be Richard in my next life and be able to talk without PowerPoint slides. I have a couple of slides this morning that I'd like to share with you. So thank you very much, Rosa, for the introduction. Thank you to Petrus and to the organizers of the conference for inviting me to come and talk to you about what my team and I have learned and are continuing to learn about what enables some South African adolescents to adjust successfully to adversity that seems to be relentless and intractable and quite inhumane at times. So what I want to do before I actually start talking to you about their resilience is I want to acknowledge two things. And the first thing that I want to acknowledge, and that you probably are aware of, is that there's a heck of a lot of criticism of doing resilience research. So there are people who say, why on earth are you studying what supports young people to beat the odds? When in effect, you should be studying what we can do to change those odds. And I think there is some merit in that argument. I'm concerned that when people kind of leverage that criticism, that we're back to that binary thinking style of either or. So you should either be studying what supports young people to beat the odds, or you should be studying what supports societies to change the odds, and probably we need a little bit of both. So the criticism might become clearer if I explain to you what kind of odds threaten the young people that we work with. And you can see some photographs up on the slide, and you can see some drawings. And you'll see I use lots of photographs, and I use lots of drawings and lots of other artifacts in my slides. Those are all produced by the young people that we work with. And they are produced by them in an effort for them to give voice to what they experience that adversity means in their everyday personal life. So Richard spoke lots about stigma. There's huge stigma when you grow up in a society like the one that you're seeing depicted on the slide. South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. So it's obvious, if you're living in this community, that there are communities that are different from you. If you grow up in communities like the ones that are depicted on the slide, you grow up usually with food insecurity, you grow up going to school where the teachers are not as well trained, where there are very few resources. If you say to them, what about mental health services? What's that? If you ask them about infrastructure, then they point to the roads that they have, and the sewage that lies in the street, and the litter, and so on and so forth. I won't belabor the point. I think the best way to describe these environments, which are called structurally disadvantaged communities, is to say they are toxic. And as mental health practitioners and as people who work with adolescents and with humans, we know the potential impact of environments like these. And so you can understand that if you continuously work with young people from these environments, there can be criticism to say, well, as long as you're explaining what supports these kids to beat those odds, society doesn't have to change those odds. And so there is validity in that criticism, but we need to do both. So that's the first acknowledgement. The second acknowledgement is that although I'm standing here, what I've learned is collaborative work. And it includes a number of fantastic co-researchers. You can see one on the slide, Dr. Makalani Malindi, but there are a number of others. I've included the names of those who are really pertinent to what I'll talk about this morning. It also includes funders. We know research is expensive, and so I'm very grateful to local funders like the National Research Foundation, as well as international funders, specifically the IDRC in Canada, for funding this work. But most importantly, it includes the young people that we've worked with. And I want to acknowledge that their insights are what helps us as practitioners and clinicians to do a better job. And sadly, we spend too little time listening to these young people. We work with them, and we work with panels from every community that we call a community advisory panel. The community advisory panel consists of adults who work with young people on a very regular basis, usually every day, teachers, social workers, no mental health practitioners. They're not available in these areas. That's the sad reality of growing up in a disadvantaged community in South Africa and generally in Africa. So I would like to acknowledge them, and that's why it's important that you see their faces. So you may be wondering, why is she showing slides with people's faces on? Well, I have their explicit permission. I have the permission of their caregivers or their parents when they do have parents. And I want you to understand that many young people say when we work with them and we negotiate this whole ethical thing of, can I show your face in the slides when I talk about what I've learned from you and what I'm continuing to learn from you? They go, I want you to show my face. I'm proud of the fact that you're learning from me. And in South Africa, where we have a history of apartheid, which silenced the majority of our people, I think as researchers and as clinicians, we have a responsibility not to silence and to acknowledge where our learning comes from. So I preface what I'm going to talk about this morning with that. And I'm going to talk about 3 broad areas. I want us to chat a little bit about a social ecological understanding of resilience, because that's key to the kinds of insights that I'll bring you. And then I want us to pause and consider what we've learned and we continue to learn. It's changing. From adolescents who are Sesotho speaking. So if you're an international guest, that's one of the many official languages in South Africa, and most of the adolescents that we work with speak Sesotho. Primarily it relates to the parts of South Africa that we've done our work in. And then look very briefly at possible implications for practice. So, you get what that communicates, right? And yes, I've tried it, doesn't work. The fact of the matter is that resilience has become such an enormously popular concept that it's being bandied about in the press, it's being used by cosmetic houses, it's sadly sometimes used to describe our response as rugby-loving or soccer-loving South Africans when our teams lose, that we have to be really resilient as we process the disaster. But although it's useful because people know the word, it's really dangerous. Because in using resilience as often as it is being used, we're losing insight into the fact that resilience has a very specific definition. And that there are 2 parts to that very specific definition. And the first is that we can't talk about resilience unless there is a context of significant threat. So sorry, for those of you who live in cities, I live in Pretoria. I know Cape Town has similar difficulties. If you live in a city where the traffic is really crazy in the morning, you're not resilient for surviving the traffic on the way to work. You cope well, possibly, or better on some days than on other days. Resilience requires significant adversity, and aging and seeing lines on your face is probably not significant adversity, firstly. Secondly, there's a sad tendency, and I think it's because we don't correct it often enough, in the press and in the way we discuss resilience, to persevere with the idea that resilience is about bouncing back or about being elastic. And certainly when we talk about the capacity to adjust well to significant adversity, there is some element of elasticity, but it's an element. It's not enough to explain the really complex process that makes up resilience. And so the most respected definition currently is probably that of Anne Maston, who is also a clinical psychologist. And she explains resilience as the capacity of a dynamic, of a changing system to adjust successfully when there are major disturbances. And those major disturbances are threats that challenge the system's capacity to be viable, to develop well, and to function effectively. And what we have understood much better in the recent years is that this capacity is not only about what's in the individual person. So way back in the 1970s, early 1980s, when the first resilience work was done by Norman Garmezy and some of his colleagues, there was this sense that resilience was an inherent trait. And for those of us who are mental health practitioners, we sometimes like to remember that. But certainly resilience is a process which leads to functional outcomes and that draws on so much more in terms of resilience enabling resources than just what is in the person. And so the slide shows you your typical Bronfenbrenner systems perspective, that we have resources at the various levels in the person, in our interpersonal relationships, and so on, all the way up to the macro level. And it's really important, Richard mentioned culture. It's really important that you see the number of times that culture is mentioned on the slide. Because probably one of the most exciting developments in resilience work is our understanding that what enables a child in North America to be well adjusted is not necessarily going to enable a child growing up in Africa to be well adjusted. And there were lovely examples of that in what Richard spoke about. And it's going to echo in what the young people are teaching us. So, by and large, this work was started by the Resilience Research Centre in Canada. Dr. Michael Unger is the director, and I've had the great privilege of working with him for over 10 years now. And Michael's work and the work of the centre has pushed this understanding that we need to be really careful when we advocate that resilience is a simplistic process and that there's a recipe that can be trotted out. And so what this has generated is what Mark Tomlinson referred to yesterday, the whole new notion of a differential impact theory of resilience. So if you were here yesterday, you would have heard Mark speak about differential susceptibility, and you probably know Jay Belsky's paper. And the whole idea of differential susceptibility, just in case you weren't here, is that if you manage to achieve functional outcomes, if the resilience process is successful, it's because of something within you. There are differences within individuals that enable that process. Differential impact theory is saying, yes, it's possible, and that's possibly part of the process. But we need to spend a lot more time looking at the social ecology and the environment around the individual to understand whether there's something different about the environment that enables specific young people to adjust well at a specific point in time. So would there be something specific in the environment that explains why a group of adolescent girls growing up in a rural context adjust well to structural disadvantage, compared with what would explain the process for a group of boys, and so on and so forth. And so this has caused quite a buzz in the resilience circles. You can see the photo of Michael on the slide. We co-hosted the Resilience Pathways Conference in Cape Town in June, so Petrus has my absolute sympathies. For those of you who are considering organizing a conference, there are many clinicians in the room. Go and talk to them first. But that brings me to the second part. And the second part is what I want to dwell on, because what we did as we began to talk more and more and more about this idea that resilience is probably enabled by the environment that is specific to particular groups of children at a particular point in time, was to think, we've never reported that in terms of the studies that we've done in South Africa. And if we go back and look at the data that we have retrospectively, will we find evidence of this? And so that's what I want to show you this morning. And I want to use two groups of young people to illustrate and interrogate the idea of differential impact, the idea that there are differences in the environment. There's something that the environment does differently that enables the resilience of young people. And the first example relates to a very rural part of South Africa in the Eastern Free State. For those of you who are South Africans, it's in the Kwakwa area, and we worked with a lovely group of adolescents, average age around 16, slight majority girls compared to boys. And these young people did mixed methods work with us. So they generated lots of qualitative artifacts. We did lots of drawings. We did lots of clay modeling. They took photographs. We used photo elicitation as methods. And this has something to do with what I mentioned earlier, the importance of qualitative work in understanding the resilience of South African young people relates to them being positioned as knowledge producers. So when they can actually express what they themselves have experienced rather than just completing a questionnaire, we get a richer, thick description of what they're understanding their resilience to be about. And so yes, we do the questionnaires. I will refer to some of the quantitative work as well, and we are currently busy with biological markers. So those are important. We've got to understand resilience from multiple perspectives because it's a really complex process. But I want you to take note of what the qualitative data taught us. And the gentlemen in the room might not like what they're seeing. The community advisory panel that we worked with in the Kwakwa area, when we first explained to them what we were learning from their young people, said, "You've got it wrong. Go back. Look at the data again. Speak to more young people. You've got it really wrong." The community advisory panel was mainly men. And what the young people in this rural part of South Africa are teaching us and continue to repeat is that what is differentially impactful about the environments that they are growing up in is that there is a mother that matters. And note my use of inverted commas, because the mother was often a mother figure and not a biological mom. And yes, that relates in a large way to the cultural values in rural communities, where there's this emphasis on interconnectedness and the idea that it really does take a village to raise a child and that everybody is responsible. But it also relates lots to our history in South Africa. And the history of apartheid, and before that, the history of colonialism, drove men out of the rural areas. Men had to leave and go to the urban areas in order to find employment. There are other theories explaining why mothers or mother figures could possibly predominate when young people explain their resilience. And those relate to matriarchal figures in families, making sure that men who renege on their financial responsibilities don't have contact with their children. So we can explain this from different perspectives. I don't think the explanation really matters. I think what's important for us, particularly if we are wanting to enable young people, is to get the message. Mother figures matter. Warm teachers, warm social workers, warm grannies, warm biological mothers, warm aunties, warm older sisters. And what do these women do? They enable the mechanisms that we associate with positive outcomes as psychologists and as clinicians. So they support agency, they support meaning making that's positive, they support self-regulation, they provide access to resources, and we can go on and on and on. But the bottom line is they are crucial to the resilience processes of these young people. So we wondered, would we get the same in the quantitative data? We've got lots of quantitative data. And let me go back. I should have used that one. We worked in M+8. I'm going to spare you all the statistical detail. We did some measurement models, and we looked at structural models, and we got significant fit. And we specified various pathways that we thought could influence a positive outcome. So remember, if resilience is a process, we've got to have proof of a positive outcome to be able to infer that there has been a resilience process. And so we looked at peer problems, we looked at mental health, internalizing issues like depression, we looked at pro-social behavior, we looked at school engagement, and the one that gave us a significant, that was predicted significantly by these paths that we had specified, which I'm not sure how well you can see it, which included the age-old understanding that resilience is enabled by resources in the individual, in the family, or in the relational context, and then in the context around the child, so the social ecology. The one that significantly predicted peer problems was resources in the family. Well, not significantly, sorry. The one where there was a path was resources in the family. And when we looked to see if there was an interaction effect with a warm mother, we did get the following stats. So pretty much what you're looking at over here means that in the quantitative data, we're getting a repeat of what the qualitative data was teaching us. Warm mother figures mean that, I will try not to do that again. Warm mother figures mean that young people are more likely not to have peer problems, and they are more likely to use their family resources, high family resources, to avoid developing peer problems when there is a warm mother figure. So we plotted this. I didn't plot it. Angie van Rensburg, who is one of the postdoctoral fellows in this team, plotted this. And what that graph is showing you is quite an interesting relationship. If you look at the green line is telling you that there's a negative relationship between mother warmth and family resources and peer problems. So what that means is when there's a warm mother figure, and there are lots of family resources. So there's access to food, there's psychological caregiving, there are parents who are or family members who are monitoring, then the chances that this young person will have peer problems are low. But when the mother figure warmth is low, then you don't get a negative relationship anymore. So when there are high family resources and mother warmth is low, there are high peer problems. And when there are low family resources and mother warmth is low, there are low peer problems. So it's a very interesting relationship that we are exploring further. But what it's pointing to is that mother figures make a difference. So we wondered, would we see similar patterns if we move to an urban community? And we work with young people who are growing up in a very similar, structurally disadvantaged urban community. And we had a smaller sample, same age range pretty much, slightly younger average age. And what we did with these young people, again, we used quantitative and qualitative methods. We asked them to make drawings, to engage in interviews, to explain to us what resilience-enabling resources accounted for their positive outcomes in life. And these were personal, relational, contextual. We grouped them. We didn't try to prompt a specific outcome. We simply said, or a specific answer, we simply said, you tell us. When you think about how challenging your life is, and they all had already confirmed that life in these township areas were really, really challenging. What is it that makes you able to get up in the morning and to go to school and to keep trying? What keeps you strong in life is the way that we often interpret it or phrase it for young people. And so we asked them to report their resources. And then what we did was we wondered whether these resources would be different depending on the living arrangement of these young people. So there's this whole notion in the literature, and I think when we speak to one another as practitioners, there's this whole idea that the level of risk increases as young people move away from a two-parent family structure. So if you read the literature, if you talk to social workers in particular, they'll tell you that there's a bias against young people who are growing up in a house where it's just a mother figure. And yes, that bias has been challenged, but it seems to persist. And then obviously we consider young people to be most vulnerable when they're growing up in an alternative household, particularly in a living in care arrangement. And given what we'd learned in the rural area, we then wondered, well, okay, what happens if we have a look and see whether the level of warmth makes a difference? We were beginning to wonder, is this possibly what is differentially impactful for South African adolescents? And I'm going to show you what we got. I'm going to say nothing. I'll put up a summary slide in a moment, just so that you understand the organization of the slide. So this is the two-parent family. There were 147 young people who reported a two-parent family, biological parents. When they reported warmth from mother and father, they reported personal strength, agency, altruism. Those are all the individual resources that they mentioned. When there was warmth from two-parent figures, they reported being connected to their family, to their peers, and to their community. When there was warmth from two-parent figures, they reported typical community-based contextual resources. So education resources, faith-based resources, and cultural heritage. And they used these to explain why they believed they did well in life. And look what happens when it's only warmth from a mother. And look what happens when there's no warmth. These are kids growing up in a two-parent family. So you have a look at that. Pretty much repeats the previous slide. And when they're living in care, and you will have noticed, I hope, that we've bolded the word mother in the slide, in each of these slides, and there's a reason for that. We asked young people how much warmth they were receiving. Some, a lot, a little, none. And for young people who were growing up in a home where there were two parents, the vast majority, over 95%, reported getting a lot of warmth from their mother figure. So what do we learn from this? What do we learn about what could possibly be differentially impactful? If we take the age-old idea that the level of risk increases depending on your living arrangement, not sure that we're going to understand what's differentially impactful. If we take the idea that the level of risk doesn't really relate to your household arrangement, who you live with, but rather to the level of warmth that you get, then we get a new understanding of what is impactful for the resilience of these South African adolescents. So we see, quite obviously, that when you report no warmth, you report very few resilience-enabling resources. They're there because other children in this community are reporting them. But these young people don't experience having access to a broad range of resources. So there's this really attenuated repertoire of what makes it possible for me to do well in life. And no surprise, most of what makes it possible for me to do well in life is me, myself, and I. And then education. Not much better, sorry again to the men in the room, not much better when they report warmth from a father figure. Only when they report warmth from a mother figure, or lots of warmth from a mother figure and a father figure, do we get altruism as a resource for enabling resilience. And so when young people reported that they knew what it was like to experience affection, lots of affection from a mom, or warmth from a mom figure and a dad figure, then they began to say things like, well, you know what makes it possible for me to get up in the morning and keep going on is my dream for the future. And the dream for the future wasn't an individualistic dream. It was, I want to come back to this community and I want to be able to uplift my family. I want to get a job that pays enough money so that I can come back and take care of my granny. I want to become somebody important so that the kids in this community can see it's okay to go to bed hungry because somebody beat those odds. And so there were these really other-focused goals, but only when they experienced that warmth. And then, very, very worryingly, we heard from Richard about the community of people, and that a community of people in Africa makes a difference. But these young people who are growing up in structurally disadvantaged communities only report that community when they've known warmth from a mother figure and a father figure. Which makes sense because it's a mother figure or a father figure, so it's not necessarily the biological parent. You might be sitting there and thinking, so this is obvious. We know about attachment theory. We've got plenty of animal studies, right? If you think of Meany studies with the rats. We know that when the mother rats were really nurturing and they licked the little rats lots, that the rats did better. We know when the mothers were neglecting and they ignored the little rats, that they did worse. So this is common sense. But is it common sense in a community like the ones that these young people are growing up in? So do you see that it shifts the focus? Resilience work traditionally has looked at what in this young person is making the difference. And yes, maybe they have got the long version or the short version of the right allele that allows them to connect with people in their community. It's possible. But something is going on in this community that allows adults who are also food insecure, who are overworked, who are frustrated, who are marginalized, who are systematically dehumanized on a daily basis, to still care and to still be warm. And that, I think, is where we need to start putting our emphasis, is on what's enabling these adults to get this right, and how can we leverage that as clinicians to support more young people. The ubiquitous one, obviously, the one that young people reported, regardless of the living arrangement, regardless of the level of warmth, was education. And that's sad. It's particularly sad because the reason why they were reporting education is so enabling of their resilience is because they have this ideal future self and the belief that education is this powerful vehicle. It's going to take me to the place where I want to be. And those of us who are South Africans know every time that we have benchmarking activities and we compare our education to education elsewhere in the world, we know where we rate. Way down the bottom, if not last. We know that only 52% of children who qualify to be in matric by virtue of their age, so only 52% of 18-year-olds are in matric. The rest have dropped out or are still struggling to get there. So there's this mismatch. There's this idealism, there's this belief, there's this hope that education will make a difference, and there's this really putrid state of affairs. And so that takes that, I'll talk about that when I talk about implications, but it takes us back to what I said right at the beginning, that there are valid criticisms of doing resilience work if we don't also do advocacy work based on what we're learning. Just quickly, in closing, we were interested in understanding as well whether adults in this urban community understood resilience in the same way that these young people did. And so what we did was we invited a sample of adults. In the end, 284 accepted our invitation. I think we invited just over 300 to engage with a team of us and to talk to us about what they understood to drive the resilience of these young people. And let's start with the one that we know was most important to the young people themselves. So young people were enamored with education. And they were enamored with education because they believed it was this powerful vehicle. Where do you think the adults stand on that? Same? Pretty much the same? So fewer than half understood how important education was. And when we began to look at when adults did mention education, and we began to look at what they were saying, what was the reason for believing education was important, it had nothing to do with education enabling better futures. It had everything to do with adults being savvy and understanding the reality of South Africa. Education is important because kids get services at school. Education is important because there's a school-based support team who's going to come and be able to recognize mental health issues. So when the adults did mention it, there's a mismatch in understanding the importance of education. And it's worrying because adults are in a really good position to decide which resources are made available to young people. What did adults value? They valued what Richard spoke about. They valued the whole idea that in interconnected communities, it's not about the family or the community, it's about both. So Mkhize, in I think 2006 in South Africa, coined the term of family community. And I'm speaking to the converted. If you've grown up in South Africa, you'll know that it's the whole idea that your community is your family. and your family is your community, and you can rely on trustworthy adults who are not your blood relatives to take care of you. And so the adults that we spoke to, that we worked with in groups, repeatedly mentioned this idea of a family community. And the young people, when we went back and looked at their responses, and we simply coded for the word family, then you get 22%. When we had a look at who they were referring to, in only 3% of those responses was it the idea that it was a family community. One guess who they were referring to the rest of the time. Yes. So again, a mismatch. And maybe it relates to this whole understanding that we live in South Africa. We experience it so regularly on how of the fluidity of cultural values, and of the increasing tendency of young people in urban areas who are growing up in townships to begin to adopt Western values, to perhaps focus more on an individual rather than a community. We have to explore that further. Last one, and I think this is the one that worried us the most, and that is that adults made a big deal out of strengths in the young people themselves. They believed that resilience was supported by particular personality traits, particular cognitive skills, and they're not necessarily wrong, but it's only a piece of the picture. Young people, in comparison, very seldom mentioned personal strengths, and when they did, it was all about how well they played sport. And maybe they've got it right. But what concerns us about the fact that the adult service providers in this area, the adults who worked with children, this idea that resilience is enabled by the self means that they can turn around, or we can turn around and blame young people when they aren't resilient enough, because it's supposedly in them, right? Well, it's not. So in the last 2 minutes that I've got, let's just talk very briefly what the implications are for practice. So as an educational psychologist, part of my job is to train educational psychologists at the university where I'm at. And so we use information like this to just reinforce what we all learned when we were training to be psychologists. And that's that you should be listening to your client. You should be learning from the person who's seeing you. And I think when it comes to driving theory, writing policies, we spend too little time listening to what adolescents know works. And it's extremely important to heed their insights, because if you look at the literature from the global north, you're not getting parent figure. You're getting a nuclear family. You're getting a mother and a father, biological mother and a father mostly. There's some mention of grandparents. But there's not this notion of an adult who's warm and who will treat you like you are their child. So perhaps one of the things that we need to do as clinicians and as practitioners is we routinely need to screen for parent figure warmth. And we know there are too few of us in this country. We know there are too few of us in Africa. But I think this is one of those good examples that fits under the idea of task sharing, where we can capacitate community members to do some of the less sophisticated or the less technical psychological work, and we can get them to start screening for parent figure warmth, and whether young people have access to an adult who is warm. And then what we need to do is we definitely need to enable and sustain. So where parent figures are warm, we've got to figure out what is it that's enabling people in these really stigmatized communities, in these communities where life is just awful. What are they doing that's enabling this warmth, and what can we do to sustain that? And then really importantly in South Africa, and Kopana Retele is doing great work in that regard, and others, we need to make sure that it includes father figures too. So we need to challenge all the hegemonic masculinity stereotypes. And then we do need to change the odds. So we do have to advocate for a society where at the very least there are better schools for our kids. We do need to lobby people who can do that. I don't say we can do it. I don't think I'd make a very good job of doing that. But if we begin to use our networks and we know who's in a more powerful position to make a change, those are the people that we need to bring onto our side. And then finally, in the last second, this needs to be repeated and repeated and repeated. So I've brought you one piece of the data. As I speak, there's a team of students and community members doing wave 2. So they've gone back into this very same community. They are repeating all the measures. And it'll be very interesting to see when these adolescents are 2 years older, is it still a parent figure that matters most? And so our job is to keep learning from young people themselves what matters most for their resilience. Thanks.